I drove city buses for a little over 3 years in Indianapolis. It wasn't the kind of job most people dream about, but I genuinely enjoyed it. The overnight routes were usually peaceful because the roads were almost empty after midnight. Most of my passengers were hospital staff finishing long shifts, airport employees heading home, or people who worked late at warehouses. By 2 in the morning, the city became so quiet that you could drive for several blocks without seeing another car. After my final stop, I'd return the bus to the depot, complete a quick inspection, hand in my paperwork, and head home. It became such a routine that I could almost do it without thinking. Everything changed after I was assigned to Route 16. It wasn't considered a difficult route, but most of the older drivers disliked it. Whenever I asked why, they'd simply shrug and say it felt different after midnight. I assumed they were just trying to scare the newer drivers. The route passed through an old industrial area before looping back toward downtown, and because there were long stretches without any passengers, it could feel lonely at times. Still, nothing about it seemed unusual during my first week. The first strange thing happened on a rainy Thursday. I'd reached the final stop just after 2 in the morning, and every passenger had stepped off the bus. Before driving back to the depot, company policy required us to walk through the bus and make sure nobody had fallen asleep in one of the seats. I glanced into the large mirror above my seat before getting up, and that's when I noticed a man sitting in the very last row. He was wearing a dark coat and looking out the window. His hands rested calmly in his lap and he didn't move at all. Thinking he'd simply missed the announcement, I called out that we'd reached the end of the line. He didn't respond. I walked toward the back of the bus, expecting him to apologize and get off. But when I reached the last row, the seat was empty. I stopped and looked around, convinced he had crouched down or moved somewhere else. I checked every row, looked beneath the seats, and even inspected the emergency exit. There was nowhere for him to have gone. The doors had never opened after the last passenger left, and the emergency alarm hadn't sounded. I remember standing there for almost a minute, trying to convince myself that I'd mistaken a shadow or a jacket for a person. Eventually, I laughed at myself, finished my inspection, and drove back to the depot. The following night, I worked the same route again. By the time I reached the last stop, I was already thinking about what had happened the night before. Every passenger stepped off, and before leaving my seat, I looked into the mirror. The man was there again, same seat, same dark coat, same posture. He was looking out the window exactly as before, completely motionless. This time I didn't take my eyes off the mirror as I walked toward him. The strange part was that he never moved, not even when I got close enough that I should have been able to see him directly. The moment I reached the last row, the seat was empty again. I searched the entire bus twice before returning to the driver's seat. On the drive back to the depot, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't tired, and I certainly wasn't imagining the same thing 2 nights in a row. The next morning, I mentioned it to another driver during our coffee break. I expected him to laugh, but instead he became unusually quiet. After a few seconds, he asked me a simple question. Was it Route 16? When I nodded, he stared into his coffee for a moment before saying, "If you ever see someone sitting in the last row after the final stop, don't walk back there." I asked him why. He shook his head and replied, "Because if you can still see him after you leave your seat, it means he finally noticed you." He refused to say another word. I tried to dismiss it as an old driver's ghost story, but over the next few nights I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. A week later, I was assigned Route 16 again. This time I counted every passenger who boarded the bus. 21 people got on throughout the route, and at the final stop I watched every single one of them get off. I counted twice just to be sure. The bus was empty. Then I looked into the mirror. There were 22 passengers. The same man was sitting alone in the back row, staring out into the darkness beyond the window. And that's when I noticed something I somehow hadn't realized before. No matter how many times I saw him, I had never once seen him get on the bus. From that night on, I stopped walking to the back of the bus after the final stop. Instead, I stayed in my seat and watched the mirror. Every single time I drove Route 16, the man was there. He never changed seats, he never looked around, he never got off with the other passengers. He simply sat in the last row staring out the window as if he were waiting for something beyond the glass. The strange part was that if I turned around to look directly at him, the seat was empty. The only place he ever appeared was in that driver's mirror. A few weeks later, curiosity finally got the better of me. Before starting my shift, I searched through old newspaper archives at the transit office. I wasn't expecting to find anything, but one article immediately caught my attention. Nearly 20 years earlier, one of the city's night buses had broken down on Route 16 while crossing an old railroad bridge. As the driver tried to restart the engine, a drunk driver slammed into the back of the bus. Several passengers were injured, and one man sitting in the last row died before paramedics arrived. The article included a small black and white photograph of the damaged bus. Even though the image was blurry, I could clearly make out a man in a dark coat sitting in the very last seat. I tried convincing myself it was only a coincidence, but after reading that article, things became even stranger. Every night the man seemed a little clearer in the mirror. At first I could only make out his outline. Then I started noticing details. His coat looked old-fashioned, the kind people wore in the early 2000s. His hair was neatly combed and one side of his face looked pale, almost gray under the dim lights inside the bus. The unsettling part wasn't his appearance, it was that he never blinked. One rainy evening I reached the final stop as usual. The last passenger stepped off and I glanced into the mirror. The man was already there. I sighed, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb toward the depot. After driving for about a minute, I looked back into the mirror again. For the first time, he wasn't looking out the window anymore. He was looking directly at me. I nearly slammed on the brakes. His expression wasn't angry. He didn't smile. He simply stared at me without moving. I looked away for only a second to keep the bus on the road. When I checked the mirror again, the last row was empty. The next morning, I requested to be removed from Route 16. The dispatcher laughed and asked if the overnight schedule was finally getting to me. I didn't argue. I just told him I'd take any other route in the city. I never drove Route 16 again. A few months later, I ran into one of the older drivers who had retired. During our conversation, I casually mentioned why I'd asked for the transfer. He listened quietly before nodding. I wondered how long it would take, he said. I asked him what he meant. He told me that almost every driver who stayed on Route 16 long enough eventually mentioned the man in the last row. Some saw him once, others saw him for years. But according to him, every driver who ever claimed the man looked directly at them ended up leaving the route within a week. I asked if anyone had ever spoken to him. The old driver shook his head. They all wanted to, he said. None of them ever got the chance. To this day, I still use public buses whenever I travel instead of driving in unfamiliar cities. Whenever I board late at night, I always glance toward the last row before taking my seat. Most of the time it's empty, but every now and then I'll notice someone sitting quietly by the window in a dark coat. I never walk to the back to get a better look, because I've learned something after all these years. Some passengers aren't waiting for their stop. They're waiting for someone to notice they're still on board. People often ask me whether I believe in ghosts after hearing this story. I honestly don't know. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything I saw. Maybe exhaustion and too many overnight shifts played tricks on my mind. But I do know one thing. Every bus route has a final stop. Everyone is supposed to get off eventually. So if you ever find yourself riding the last bus home late at night, and you notice someone still sitting alone in the back after everyone else has left, don't be the person who asks why they're still there.